Saturn is one of the most beautiful planets in our solar system, and one of its most prominent features are its impressive rings. These rings are composed of countless small rocks and particles of ice, and they encircle the planet in a stunning display. The rings of Saturn have been a source of wonder and fascination for centuries, and with good reason. But what if Earth had rings like Saturn? How would our planet be different if it had such a feature? In this article, we'll explore what Earth would be like if it had rings like Saturn, and how this might affect our planet in ways we can't even imagine. How big would Earth's rings be? The size of Earth's rings would depend on the material that makes them up. Saturn's rings are made up of small particles of ice and rocks, and are estimated to measure around 250,000 kilometers in diameter. The particles that make up Saturn's rings are believed to be made up of ice crystals, clumps of dust and small rocks, and so if Earth were to have similar rings, they would likely be made up of similar material. However, the size of Earth's rings would be significantly smaller than Saturn's. This is because Earth is much closer to the Sun than Saturn is, and so the gravitational pull of the Sun would be much stronger on Earth's rings than it is on Saturn's. This would mean that Earth's rings would be much thinner than Saturn's, and likely measure between 10,000 and 15,000 kilometers in diameter. How would Earth's rings impact the solar system? The impact that Earth's rings would have on the solar system would be profound. The most obvious effect would be on the appearance of the solar system. Earth's rings would make the solar system look much more spectacular, and would have a dramatic effect on the way that the planets are viewed from Earth. The effect on the other planets in the solar system would be less obvious, but still significant. As Earth's rings are composed of small particles, they would be affected by the gravitational pull of the other planets in the solar system. This would cause the particles in the rings to move and shift, resulting in the rings changing shape and size over time. This could potentially cause some disruption to the orbits of the other planets, though this is unlikely to be significant. What would Earth look like with rings? From Earth, the rings of Earth would be one of the most stunning sights in the night sky. They would encircle the planet in a beautiful halo of light, and would be visible from anywhere on the planet. The rings would be much thinner than Saturn's, but they would still be quite prominent. They would look almost like a giant pair of glasses encircling the planet, and they would be a beautiful addition to the night sky. The rings of Earth would also be visible during the day, though they would be much harder to see. The particles that make up the rings would reflect sunlight, and so they would be faintly visible even during the day. This would provide an interesting contrast to the night sky, and would be a fascinating sight to behold. What would the impact of Earth's rings be on life? The impact that Earth's rings would have on life on Earth is difficult to predict, but it is likely to be significant. The most obvious effect would be on the temperature of the planet. The particles that make up the rings would reflect some of the sunlight that reaches the planet, meaning that the planet would be slightly cooler than it otherwise would be. This could potentially have an impact on the climate, though it is difficult to predict exactly what this would be. The rings of Earth would also have an effect on the length of days and nights. As the rings of Earth would be in a slightly different position than the Sun, the amount of sunlight that reaches the planet would be slightly different. This could potentially cause the days and nights to be a little longer or shorter than they otherwise would be. What would the impact of Earth's rings be on the climate? The impact that Earth's rings would have on the climate would depend on the size of the rings. If the rings of Earth were larger, then they would reflect more sunlight, and so the planet would be slightly cooler than it otherwise would be. This could potentially have a significant impact on the climate, though it is difficult to predict exactly what this would be. On the other hand, if the rings of Earth were smaller, then they would reflect less sunlight, and so the planet would be slightly warmer than it otherwise would be. Again, it is difficult to predict exactly what this would be, but it is likely that the overall effect would be to slightly warm the climate of the planet. What would the impact of Earth's rings be on astronomy? The impact that Earth's rings would have on astronomy would be significant. The rings of Earth would be visible from anywhere in the solar system, and so they would provide a unique perspective on the planets of the solar system. They would also make it much easier to observe and study the planets, as the rings would act as a sort of window into the solar system. The rings of Earth would also make it much easier to observe stars and other celestial objects. The rings would reflect the light from stars and other objects, and so they would be much easier to see from Earth. This would make it much easier for astronomers to study the stars, and would provide a unique perspective on the universe. How would Earth's rings affect human technology? The impact that Earth's rings would have on human technology is difficult to predict, but it is likely to be significant. For one thing, it would be much easier to launch satellites into space. The rings would provide a platform for satellites to be launched from, and so it would be much easier to place satellites in orbit. This could potentially revolutionize the way that we use satellites, and could open up a whole new range of possibilities. The rings of Earth could also be used to collect energy. The particles that make up the rings would reflect sunlight, and this energy could be collected and used to power satellites and other spacecraft. This could potentially revolutionize the way that we use space, and could open up a whole new range of possibilities. Could we create artificial rings around Earth? The idea of creating artificial rings around Earth is an intriguing one, and it is certainly possible. In theory, it would be possible to create an artificial ring around Earth using small particles of ice and rocks. These particles would be placed in orbit around the planet, and the gravity of the planet would keep them in place. However, creating an artificial ring around Earth would be a difficult and costly endeavor. The particles that make up the rings would need to be carefully positioned in order to create a stable and long-lasting ring, and this would require significant amounts of money and resources. It is also unclear how much of an impact such a ring would have on the planet, and so it is difficult to say whether it would be worth the effort. Conclusion: what if Earth had rings like Saturn? The thought of Earth having rings like Saturn is certainly a fascinating one, and it's easy to see why it has captured the imaginations of people for centuries. It is certainly possible for Earth to have rings, and the impact that they would have on the planet would be significant. The rings would make the solar system look much more spectacular, and would have an effect on the climate, the length of days and nights, and human technology. The idea of creating artificial rings around Earth is an intriguing one, but it is a difficult and costly endeavor. It is unclear how much of an impact such a ring would have on the planet, and so it is difficult to say whether it would be worth the effort. Nevertheless, it is clear that the thought of Earth having rings like Saturn is an exciting one, and one that is sure to capture the imaginations of people for many years to come.